Welcome. You're listening to Retirement with Meaning. I'm Carmen Aceta, I'm your host, and this is episode number 8, What to Do in Retirement. How about grow yourself? This podcast concludes the orientation and framework I've been trying to give in the first 7 podcasts. And I suggest that you listen to all 8 of these before moving on if you're at all interested, because you'll have a better overview, a kind of a frame, container to hold all this and sort of orient you and to be pointed back to. Actually, I'm claiming man's prerogative to change his mind, because I'm going to begin talking about the being to doing shift, or at least a lot about being now instead of waiting till episode 9. And then in episode 9, I'm going to start into the important shifts in the second half of life, period. And being to doing is one of them. I realize my title could evoke a or perhaps feel a bit insulting about how about grow yourself. And could have been surprising if you were looking more for a new hobby or a group to belong to, something like that. But I'm not going to be talking about hobbies and groups to belong to, although they have their place. And I'll explain a little more in a moment what I meant by my title, and hopefully you won't feel insulted. So I'm going to propose a question. Can you imagine anyone knowingly wanting to enter and proceed through adult life with the coping skills of a child or an adolescent? I can't, and yet I've seen a lot of people in that very handicapped position. My point about growing yourself and growing myself is grounded in the belief that moving into our retirement years is every bit as important a shift as moving from childhood to adolescence and adolescence to adulthood. And as with most of what I talk about in this podcast, I will be elaborating on those things from time to time as we move along. As we approach and enter retirement, or start to follow the yellow brick road at any point, I think it's good to realize, we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto. Retirement isn't a new state. It's really more a new ballgame. But the rules have changed, and often no one let us in on that important fact. I didn't learn about the second half of life until I was in my late 70s. By then, well into my second half of life, and for many people, well into their retirement years, although I retired rather late in my life. I can't overemphasize the importance of this first half, second half shift and your second half of life. I hope with this podcast to give you a better chance than I had by learning about these important things early, or earlier certainly than your late 70s, as I did mine. So as we go along here, you're going to hear some answers to the question what to do in retirement. And I think there's a pretty good chance you wouldn't be hearing these exact questions from too many people. Although the second half is better known than it was 7 or 8 years ago when I first began getting exposed to it, I think it's still largely unknown to the majority of people. One of my answers to what to do in retirement is learn the new ground rules. And in this case, get help with learning those new rules if you don't know them. Rules might be a bit harsh, but knowing the new principles in the second half of life can be of enormous use to you. As I mentioned, I used the first 7 podcasts to help you try to get the lay of the land, so to speak. And they give somewhat of an overview of making the shifts from the first to the second half of life, or at least background for it. So I believe investing the time in reading and listening to these previous episodes, if you haven't, will help you to sort of update your GPS and help you reach your own personal Emerald City in better shape than Dorothy did. So this first principle is one of the biggest, most important ones, and that's from doing to being. And I'll be addressing it in other shifts, in greater detail than I did in these earlier podcasts. It's one of the major shifts you have to make to help you really mine the full riches of retirement. And you'll be able to determine the possibilities that can become part of the retirement you can have. It's work, but I think it's well worth the time and energy. And you probably have said more than once that you didn't know what you were going to do with your time in retirement. I think we've all experienced times when work wasn't really work. And I know many of us look forward to easing up after 40 or 50 or more years of working. I get that. But hopefully this effort around the second half of life will have a newness for you and a life for you. I believe many people experience the life going out of work or of their career well before the time they actually retire. And we can find that much of what we do is drudgery. We have no heart connection with it. It's not really important to us, but for any of a number of reasons, we're doing it. So then one of the big payoffs in the second half of life can be regaining enthusiasm and desire and what has heart for you, what you're connected with, and you're choosing to do it, and somebody isn't telling you that here's what you're going to do. Another answer or a variation of an answer that I would give to what to do in retirement is learn being. From doing to being is one of the most important shifts from the first half of life to the second half. And I'm not talking in terms of either or, but more both and. It's more a movement along a continuum, with maybe being having a larger role than previously, but it doesn't mean if the first half of life was mostly about doing, that now the second half is mostly going to be about being. Much of the growth, I believe, will be being oriented in a way because much of being also has a overlap or is part of spirituality. And much of the work or much of the second half of life involves spirituality, which is one of the shifts we'll talk about along the way. I might also accurately say that it's more about the quality of the being that drives our doing. There would be an important shift because we could do the same things we were doing in the first half of life, but with a very different driving force behind them or underneath them or within them. The first half of life required a lot of doing, a lot of outward action, getting an education, getting a job, acquiring the material things of the world that you needed or wanted. Being will require more going inward, reflecting, slowing down. I think many of us have already begun that work, before we get to our retirement years, but a lot of people haven't either. And for them, it can be new and probably uncomfortable if you haven't spent much time on the being end of the continuum I mentioned. And you might need some help. Unfortunately, there's a lot of help available in this area. I think there are good reasons why mindfulness meditation is so popular at this time. On to another answer to what to do in retirement. I would say become the best person you can be. And I want to acknowledge that the issue of use of time in retirement is a very real concern. It troubles a lot of people. It's often part of their anxiety problems. I imagine it might be somewhat of an issue for you, or you might not be listening to this podcast. So my basic answer is to become the best person you can be, but you decide what best means for you. I'm not saying that just as my own assessment. It doesn't necessarily mean as a moral value. But we can have quite a bit inside of us that has remained pretty much untapped, usually for good reason. Just like the first people to come to America back in the colonial days or pre-colonial days, they didn't start out writing books and writing symphonies and so on when they got here. They started out finding food sources and shelter and protection from what might be hostile people and the things they had to do for survival. I'd like to share with you some more of what Carl Jung had to say on the opportunity in the second half of life. And first I have to tell you that I've drawn on material from a paper, Individuation and the Self, by Martin Schmidt, who is a member of the Society of Analytical Psychology in the UK. I tried to pick out ideas that were understandable, and if I can understand them, you probably can too. But I like what Jung has to say. It flies directly in the face of the gloomy, discouraging messages our culture in the U.S. tells us about aging. And one of the main reasons I developed my original website and now my podcast was to provide a more hopeful message. And I wanted to support others in moving into and through their retirement years, their second half of life. So the author of the article, Martin Schmidt, says, and I'm quoting from here, that he, Jung, uses the concept of the self to describe his understanding of who we are, and the concept of individuation to describe the process by which we can fulfill our potential to become all that we can be, end quote. And what he says about the self goes deeper than my purposes here, so I'm going to focus on individuation. Let me insert another answer to a question here, which is pertinent. What to do in retirement? I would say, take growth-oriented risks. Quoting again, Jung saw individuation as the process of self-realization, the discovery and experience of meaning and purpose in life, the means by which one finds oneself and becomes who one really is. He admitted, however, human nature has an invincible dread of becoming more conscious of itself. This takes us right back to there's no growth without risk. Change will subject us to feelings of anxiety and vulnerability. And you'll also see or hear many times from me about the importance of support for your venturing. Soren Kierkegaard says, to venture causes anxiety, but not to venture is to lose one's self. And to venture in the highest sense is precisely to become conscious of oneself. And President James Garfield said, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. But first, it will make you miserable. Yes, coming to know the truth about ourselves can be a very uncomfortable experience, but also very rewarding. A conversation I frequently had with clients when I was operating my psychotherapy practice often ended with my saying something like this. Well, Joe, it seems like one way or the other you're going to feel anxious. You can continue to feel the familiar anxiety you came in with, but that keeps you stuck where you don't like being. But it's a choice. Or you can experience the anxiety of moving into unfamiliar territory. That anxiety will help you grow and move on into something more vital. That's a choice too. But either way, you're going to be anxious. And then I would suggest, if you're going to be anxious one way or the other, why not be anxious with the anxiety that will take you somewhere and not keep you stuck where you don't like to be, but feels more comfortable. Now it's time to take a little break for an infomercial. I'll start out with just a couple of the direct factual announcements. One, I'm happy to announce that my podcasts are now on my Facebook page in my timeline, and you can reach them either by going to Facebook and searching for Retirement with Meaning, or just type in the URL, facebook.com/retirement with meaning, and that should take you to it. They're also on my YouTube channel. And honestly, I'm not that familiar with YouTube myself. I believe you can just go to YouTube and type in either Retirement with Meaning or Carmen Aceta, and that should bring it to you unless you know a better way. This part that I'm about to tell you is slightly more complex. I'm trying to aim my podcast at three general categories of people in or near retirement or in their second half of life. The first would be for those who are struggling some way or another, who are confused, uncertain about what's going on in this time of their life, may have some degree of depression, health issues, some difficulty in their situation that involves others perhaps. And I know that what I'm proposing, what I'm talking about, to respond to it or even think about it requires a certain amount of focus and energy for you to engage with the things that I'm putting before you. And the seriousness of your difficulties can keep you from having the energy to get started on something, or possibly even feel the possibility that things can get better. There's more than what's happening right now. Help is available for situations that many find themselves in at this stage of their life. Maybe the circumstances themselves change. But in the meantime, I invite you to listen or keep listening. For one, you may just get some support or feel a little better and get to a place where you can maybe take some beginning step into this second half of life realm and the possibilities that it holds. The second group would be those who have energy and a certain degree of enthusiasm about this time, but are mainly looking for something to fill their time, place to volunteer, have some company, and you're reasonably content. You too are welcome if you have an interest in this subject, even though you're not planning to do anything in particular about it. But I also know that sometimes in this sort of situation, the things that are giving us some satisfaction begin to lose their zest for us. And once again, we feel a need to make a change. And then maybe that change works for a while, and then we need to make another change. And that can be indicative that something a little below all that might need to be addressed in order to find the satisfaction or the level of retirement well-being that you want. Certainly, you would be welcome to jump in and change how you use my podcast or why you listen to it at any point where you realize that something's changing or needs to change possibly for you. The third category would be those who know they want something more. They're looking for a renewing meaning and purpose. They want something that fills their soul. They want something that feeds them. They want maybe true transformation. And they want something that will also go back and result in good for others, perhaps. And they have to do some work first for that to happen. You too are also welcome. So no matter which of those categories you fit into, and you might be somewhere between them also, rather than right on the spot, but I invite you to invest whatever amount of energy you're willing to expend for now for what you want. That might change, and you're welcome at that point too to take part in my podcast in whatever way works for you. There's no one standard for everyone to come up to. Getting back to my client Joe, I'll start with another question answer. What to do in retirement? My answer is have growing pains. I tried to acknowledge the real pain and vulnerability that clients like Joe were feeling, and I validated the effort that edging into their fear took. And I'd talk about the possibility of finding some small piece they might feel they could take on as a start. Sometimes I'd say my hope for them was that they could take a tiny beginning step towards change or growth, wherever they felt they could start. And again, I validated that my hope for them didn't have to be their hope for them, not to make them feel embarrassed or ashamed if they wouldn't take it on. And also, I'd always talk about support, which unfortunately in itself is often a painful topic for many people. They feel less than because they need support. Many times they would make their own judgment of themselves and say, that's pathetic. For most of us, we're going to need help. We're going to need support to deal with some of the difficulties that are just raised within us, let alone the outward situation. This is not a good time for rugged individualists, and yet that's what our culture seems to want us to be. Even at a more global level, even the people involved with the Hero's Journey projects are coming to say that like the superhero, the lone wolf who rides in and cleans up the town or cleans up the country or whatever, is no more. So the problems are just too big. And what they talk about now is the ensemble hero. The hero isn't just one person, but it's multiple people, and maybe each with their facet to contribute or whatever. But that the jobs now are so big that one person is a thing of the past. And hopefully, even at your more local level, you can give yourself permission to receive help. It's the game changer. Another what to do in retirement, I would say refute ageism. And you could legitimately ask why you should do any of this. And really, you have to come up with an answer that satisfies you to even make a tentative start. But I offer the following as grist for you to run through your personal mill. I mentioned earlier our culture's less than encouraging attitude about aging. It considers the second half of life as a time of ongoing diminishment, irrelevance, and ending in death. We hear a lot about the various isms, but we don't hear enough about ageism and its damaging potential. The second half of life message directly contradicts the culture's message. It points you towards enhanced life rather than living death before you actually die. The positive message alone is worth a try, I think. But how we think about aging is going to have an awful lot to do with how we age. A related reason is that the second half approach is alive. I'll tell you Soren Kierkegaard's quote again here, but it fits. To venture causes anxiety, but not to venture is to lose oneself. And to venture in the highest sense is precisely to become conscious of oneself. So we might have to override our hardwiring, as Jung implied above too. But once again, big payoffs hang on our willingness to bear with the necessary effort. And happily, our retirement or our second half years are a fertile time for growing. They're not the barren landscape that our culture paints for us. And anxiety is alive. There's energy there. And we used to have a saying we used when I was facilitating ropes courses or adventure-based counseling courses, that it's all right to have butterflies in your stomach, but get them in formation. And that's what we kind of have to be about, is not trying to make the anxiety, which has a lot of energy in it, go away, but to get that energy sort of focused and organized. Not that we don't feel it, but that we can still use it towards our goal. I'm going to say something now about anxiety as a hot ticket, so to speak. I think underlining the growth opportunities in the second half of life, James Hollis, who I've quoted before, says the following in Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life. He's, quote, "The world is more magical, less predictable, more autonomous, less controllable, more varied, less simple, more infinite, less knowable. more wonderfully troubling that we could ever have imagined being able to tolerate when we were young. And then he adds, anxiety is the price of the ticket to life. Intrapsychic depression is the byproduct of our refusal to come aboard. So if you're somewhat hesitant, which I can understand, a lot of people are, I hope you can gradually bring yourself to come aboard. And if you don't have an idea of where you want to go, to see where the ride takes you until you do have an idea of where you want to go. So let me say a little bit more about anxiety as being alive, as I just remembered an incident from my days facilitating the ropes courses that I'd like to share with you. It occurred on what we called the Pamper Pole. It was a utility pole about 30 to 35 feet high, and the first objective was to climb to the top and stand on the very top. Now, this pole was not like a tree. It did not have a huge trunk. There was room for your feet and maybe a little more, but you were basically standing on a pretty small area of the real estate and 35 or so feet in the air. So the climb alone was evocative for most participants who mostly had issues with height. And they knew what they were climbing towards doing was, once on top, the next step was to leap from the pole like a person on the flying trapeze to try to grab a suspended trapeze bar that was some distance in front and below them. It was a challenging distance. The toughest part was transferring from the pole to the very top. It was a particularly precarious feeling, and so when you tried to make that transition, it took most people a while to finally go for it. And that transfer process created a heightened sense of vulnerability. It was sort of a sudden all-in you had to do. You couldn't do it gradually and inch your way up. It took a quick, precise movement. And it took most people a long time to gather the courage to do it. Of course, the climber was belayed in case he fell, but that didn't do much to dim the sense of danger, especially at that particular transfer point I was talking about. So, in the light of what I've just been saying, another what to do in retirement would be an aerialist. So one day I was waiting to belay the next climber, and a facilitator had said something that made me realize that I had never seen anyone depressed at the top of the Pamper Pole. There were certainly people who were suffering from depression in the group, but not when they were up there. They were extremely anxious, but the energy was charging through every cell in their body. And the focus on their inner battle about whether to climb the pole or make the transition to the top or go for the leap, there was a battle going on. And it was a fierce battle. They could have chosen to sit and observe others from the ground, but they had chosen to take the risk. And whether or not they caught the trapeze bar was immaterial. They already had their reward at the top of the pole. Even getting partway up the pole would have been rewarding. Either way, I think they could have quoted the Rumi poem and shouted, "See, I am alive." Well, a final for now reason for doing this growth work is to avail yourself of some powerful help. I think the knowledge and tools you acquire as you go along will be invaluable for just about any part of your life. And they'll help your transition into your retirement years and enhance the quality of your retirement years. And it's not a one-size-fits-all deal. You can choose the intensity or depth of your immersion. Pick something that fits for you as a start. Sometimes even a seemingly small change produces big benefits. So, I hope you'll give something in here that you come across in my podcast or elsewhere in the same subject a try. And as I told my other clients, or my clients, you're not my client, my hope for you doesn't have to be your hope for you. But hopefully you'll come up with a hope for you. And one stratagem that you can try if you wish, and anxiety is an issue for you, don't want to do this with high anxiety, but with lower levels, it's good to practice with less intensity. As you encounter the anxious moments in your life, either the ones you know you experience a lot or a sudden one, but not too severe one, just try to be aware. Try to stay with your feeling a little bit, even if only for a few seconds, and breathe and experience your experience. Once again, it's time to wrap up. Thank you for listening, and I hope you'll listen to Podcast 9, which will be out in about a week after this one. And I'm going to begin talking about the shifts from the first to the second half of life, what they are, what's important about them, and how they contribute to the richness that's available in the second half of life. I hope you'll join me. And I'll close with this from Pete Drucker. There is the risk you cannot afford to take, and there is the risk you cannot afford not to take.